In June 2025, representatives from the United States and China gathered at Lancaster House in London for a two-day closed-door meeting aimed at easing escalating trade tensions and advancing the implementation of prior agreements made during the Geneva talks. After the talks, both sides announced the completion of a new trade framework agreement, signaling a possible pause in the five-year-long trade war between the two nations.
双方原则上就落实两国元首6月5号通话共识以及日内瓦会谈共识达成了框架。
According to the agreement, the U.S. will retain some tariffs on Chinese goods, with the overall tariff rate maintained at approximately 55%. This represents a significant drop from the peak punitive tariff rate of 145% implemented during the Trump administration, though it remains well above historical levels. China, in return, pledged not to escalate retaliatory measures and to keep its tariffs on U.S. goods at around 10%.
On the Hill, so the idea is we're going to go back and speak to President Trump and make sure he approves it. They're going to go back and speak to President Xi and make sure he approves it, and if that is approved, we will then implement the framework that we have worked hard over these last 2 days. Obviously, the team stayed at it until it was done late into the evening.
As part of the deal, China will resume exports of rare earths and critical magnetic materials, while the U.S. will show goodwill in areas such as student visas and technological exchanges. Both sides also announced the establishment of a high-level trade liaison mechanism, with follow-up negotiations on the details scheduled within 3 months. The trade war began back in 2018, when the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on $60 billion worth of Chinese imports, citing forced technology transfers and unfair trade practices. The tariffs were later expanded to cover over $300 billion worth of Chinese goods. China quickly retaliated, imposing tariffs of 15% to 25% on U.S. soybeans, automobiles, and chemical products. The tit-for-tat measures escalated tensions rapidly, damaging bilateral trade and creating fractures in global supply chains. During this initial clash, both U.S. and Asian stock markets suffered significant losses. In 2020, the two sides briefly reached a Phase 1 agreement, with China promising to increase purchases of U.S. goods in exchange for a partial tariff rollback. However, the agreement was never fully implemented and quickly collapsed under the pressure of the pandemic and rising geopolitical tensions. By 2025, after returning to power, Trump used the trade conflict to project strength and fulfill campaign promises. On April 2nd, he announced Liberation Day tariffs, and in the face of Chinese resistance, continued raising tariffs, eventually imposing a sweeping 145% tariff on all Chinese imports, marking the highest level in the history of the U.S. China trade war. In response, China imposed retaliatory tariffs of up to 125% on U.S. exports, covering sensitive sectors such as agriculture, energy, and technology. This vicious cycle of retaliation pushed bilateral trade relations to the brink and laid the groundwork for renewed negotiations. May 2025 marked a turning point. Under the mediation of the World Trade Organization, both sides agreed to a 90-day moratorium on new tariffs and pledged not to implement additional measures during this period. The U.S. issued an executive order to lower tariffs on small-scale Chinese imports from 120% to 54%, signaling a willingness to de-escalate and pave the way for further talks. During this cooling-off period, market sentiment gradually stabilized and high-level interactions resumed. In early June, Trump and Xi Jinping held their first phone call since Trump's return to office. The 90-minute conversation underscored the importance of avoiding misjudgment and stabilizing bilateral economic ties. This dialogue helped set the stage for the London negotiations and ultimately enabled the framework agreement to take shape. Beyond tariffs, the two sides placed other strategic chips on the negotiating table, namely rare earths and talent exchange. China currently controls over 90% of the world's rare earth refining capacity. These elements, though limited in quantity, are essential for electric vehicle motors, military radars, missile guidance systems, and advanced semiconductor manufacturing. For the U.S., rare earths are an invisible backbone of its high-tech and defense industries. In 2024, China restricted exports of magnetic rare earths such as neodymium and terbium, disrupting the supply chains of U.S. companies like Boeing and Raytheon and reportedly delaying production schedules for parts of the F-35 fighter jet by several weeks. Companies like Tesla and Apple also experienced cost hikes and supply pressures for motors and speaker modules, prompting industry-wide petitions urging the government to reach a resolution. Under the new agreement, China pledged to resume stable rare earth and magnetic material exports to the U.S. with increased transparency, while the U.S. agreed to relax student visa restrictions and stop treating academic exchanges as potential security threats. This brought the Harvard incident into the spotlight. In a public speech, Trump accused Harvard University of long tolerating foreign infiltration and alleged that some Chinese students were involved in technological espionage. He then tightened visa screening procedures, especially for graduate students from China, Iran, and Russia, asserting that American educational resources must not become a platform for foreign regimes to develop weapons. Now, both sides have agreed to establish a transparency supremacy mechanism for academic information. The U.S. will ease restrictions on high-tech studies, while China has pledged to uphold research ethics and academic freedom. Though rare earths and education may seem unrelated, both are in fact strategic resources of modern competition, one tied to military and industrial infrastructure, the other to future talent in the battlefield of knowledge. From Washington to Beijing, from investors to strategists, this new agreement is seen as a sign of de-escalation, but few believe it heralds true peace.
So I think the most important take-home from the trade talks in London is that they did talk, and we will have to wait until the leaders decide if the agreement in London does meet the expectations of Xi Jinping and President Trump. And until that point, we really don't know if this is going to be successful.
Stephen Nagy, a professor of politics and international studies at International Christian University, noted that some view the agreement as a form of delayed stabilization, providing time for internal restructuring such as accelerating domestic substitution and building more independent tech systems, but unlikely to reverse long-term export trends.
所以现在就是说能看到的只是说可控的地步。不可能，两家不可能说放弃，比如说美国不可能放弃说用芯片来做一个它的谈判武器，中国也是确实不可能，它也是愿稀土作为一个谈判的武器。这也就是说，现在已经回到了一个现实政治。
Observed that the heart of the trade war was never just about trade. Experts point out that U.S. China competition has already expanded to include technology, finance, military affairs, and diplomacy. Although this agreement eases economic tensions, it does not address more sensitive issues like chip export controls, technology bans, or South China Sea military deployments. As Scott Kennedy, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center for Asia Policy, put it, this is not the end of the war, but a strategic pause before the next round of competition. From punitive tariffs of 145% to a 55% framework agreement, the U.S.-China trade tug-of-war has entered a temporary truce, but this does not mean the underlying issues are resolved, nor that bilateral relations have stabilized. The agreement still requires final signatures from Trump and Xi Jinping. Its terms are not yet fully finalized, and include a 90-day compliance observation period. Should either side determine the other has breached the agreement, the previously imposed high tariffs may be reinstated. Furthermore, technology restrictions, military activities in the South China Sea, and tensions in the Taiwan Strait remain key variables in shaping mutual trust. As many analysts point out, this agreement is more of a breathing space, allowing both economies to regroup and leaving room for either future negotiations or renewed conflict. For businesses, this moment brings both opportunity and risk. For the global economic system, it is an ongoing test of order, dominance, and the shape of future competition. The U.S.-China rivalry isn't over, it has simply taken a new form.